Okay, sorry, I was having trouble getting off mute there. Thank you, Ignacio. Yeah, my name is Sven Lindstrom. I work with the Department of Health Site Discovery, Assessment, and Remediation section of the HERE office. Today I'm going to be talking actually about the response action process itself, how it's done or how it's supposed to be done here in Hawaii. And I'll also talk about some of the programs that we have to assist property owners and developers in doing those remediation steps. I have a lot to cover today, and just a short time, so forgive me if I'm kind of rushing through it, but hopefully you'll get the important points here. Our process follows the laws, regulations, and guidance presented in the Hawaii Revised Statute, which is HRS 128D, and also referred to as the Hawaii Environmental Response Law, and the Hawaii Administrative Rules, which is HAR 11451, also known as the State Contingency Plan, and of course the HERE office's own Technical Guidance Manual, or the TGM. Next slide, please. Other useful references include the Evaluation of Environmental Hazards, or the EHE guidance, and our EAL Surfer, as well as the Clean Fill guidance. And there's one more item that didn't make it onto the slide here, which is the 2007 Long-Term Management for Petroleum Contaminated Soils and Groundwater Guidance. I have some links at the end to all of those documents. Basically, everyone working in environmental remediation in the state of Hawaii should be familiar with these documents. Next slide, please. So Section 128D-4 of the Environmental Response Law mandates that we protect human health and the environment from the release or threat of a release of hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. It's quite broad and an inclusive authority to act whenever there's a substantial endangerment to the public health or welfare or the environment from environmental hazards. The law roughly mirrors the Federal Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, but one key difference from CERCLA is that our regulation and our other guidance also includes oil and petroleum contaminants. Next slide, please. There we go. So first, I just want to put a quick word in about the Tier 1 EAL, because this is a source of quite a bit of confusion from environmental consultants and also from even among our own regulators sometimes. When you start to characterize the contamination at your site, regardless of whether it's in a commercial industrial area or it's below the UIC line, the first thing we need you to do is to compare it to the most restrictive Tier 1 environmental action level. These action levels are listed in the EHE guidance in the lookup tables, and they're also available on the EAL Surfer, which is what you're looking at right now. You just set the Surfer to unrestricted use, drinking water resource, and less than 150 meters to the nearest surface water. And you can see that in the center image here, and I believe it's the default settings for the Surfer. These are the most stringent environmental action levels. So if the contaminant concentrations do not exceed these tier 1 EALs, of course, assuming that you've done your sampling correctly, then the media can be reused anywhere without restrictions. You can use the soil to backfill a children's playground, even if it's next to a stream, even if it's above a well, it's not a problem. But there are less stringent EALs, and they may be applicable to your site. For example, if your site's not above a drinking water, or if the land use is commercial industrial. And that's fine. We want you to go ahead and compare your lab results to those EALs as well, but we need you to compare them to both. And you might want to know why. Well, it's because if your results do not exceed the less stringent EALs that are particular to your site, no remediation or special management may be necessary as long as that soil stays on that site. But that soil may not be allowed to be excavated and then reused on another site with unrestricted land use, such as a residential property, or it might not be allowed to be used on a property that's above a drinking water aquifer. The groundwater from your site may not be allowed to be dewatered into a storm drain. Soil and groundwater from your site may only be allowed to be taken to another commercial industrial site with permission from the Department of Health. Or it may only be allowed to be disposed of at a landfill or a wastewater treatment facility. So although your results may not exceed the EAL specific to your site, there may still be institutional controls that apply to any of the media that may be removed from your site. So that's why we want you to compare to the most stringent Tier 1 EAL when you start your assessment of the property. Information about proper reuse of soil is also available in our Clean Fill guidance. And if you have additional questions about disposal of groundwater, you can also contact the DOH's Clean Water branch. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to the remediation process. So on the left, you can see here, I've cited the sections in the administrative rules that reference each step of the process that we go through when we're assessing a site. The first step, of course, is to identify a release and report it. In general, we rely on the public and specifically on the property owner to do this step. The Hawaii Environmental Response Law clearly states that you must report a release of a reportable quantity. The opinion of the HERA office is that all releases need to be reported, even when, sometimes especially when, the source and the quantity of the release is unknown. For example, from a historical release. Because any release could present a significant threat to human health and the environment, as outlined in 11-451 Part A. So if you're excavating and you encounter grossly contaminated soil, stop work and immediately call it in. If you're collecting samples for a Phase 2 site investigation and you identify contaminants at concentrations above the Tier 1 EAL, call it in to us. We want you to get it on the record so it can be assessed, and if a response action is deemed necessary, we can get it addressed. There's no fines for over-reporting contamination, but there can be substantial fines for not reporting it. Next slide, please. So initially, releases are reported to our Emergency Preparedness and Response section, which is called EP&R, where they assign a release ID. The EP&R on-scene coordinator will do a quick assessment to determine if an emergency response is required. Sometimes this is completed over the phone. If necessary, the on-scene coordinator will either close out the incident with an NFA, or if contamination remains on site following the emergency response, they will transfer the site to our section, the site, that STAR section, for additional assessment and remediation. If the release is historic and the contaminant does not appear to be posing an immediate risk to human health and the environment, then it will likely be turned directly over to STAR without an emergency response. And the STAR Remedial Project Manager, or RPM, will add the site and the release to our iHear database and will conduct a preliminary site prioritization. So initially it's reported to our EP&R. They determine if there's an emergency that needs to be responded to, and if not, it ends up in our section, which is site discovery, assessment, and remediation. Next slide, please. So section 128D-7 of the Hawaii Environmental Response Law requires that the site be prioritized or ranked using the criteria you can see here from Hawaii Administrative Rules 11-451 Part 9. And that ranking is supposed to be used to determine which sites get addressed by our RPMs first. You can see the criteria that's listed in the administrative rules on this slide. It's a little hard to see, it's highlighted in yellow. Additionally, we also look at other factors such as sensitive receptors, like is there an estuary or a child care facility nearby, multiple sources of releases, multiple stakeholders, and the like. Usually it's pretty obvious when a site or release is a high priority. Red Hill, the airport, Hickam Housing, most military sites, Gasco, sites with high concentrations, very toxic substances that are close to receptors and have potentially open preferential pathways would be high or medium priority sites. The HERA office is required to focus on oversight and sometimes management of responses at high and medium priority sites, which pose real and substantial threats to human health and the environment. But most sites in the state are actually low priority. And a low priority site is primarily the landowner's responsibility to address and cleanup activities. And the HERE office's role is supposed to be as a source of guidance and a repository for records for those low priority sites. Next slide, please. So the first step after a release has been identified is to characterize the site. The purpose is to determine the nature and the extent of the contamination. What contaminants of potential concern or COPCs are present, what are their concentrations, and where are they? Besides just delineating the current extent of contamination, you also want to determine whether the contaminant plume is migrating, especially if it may be migrating off-site. To characterize your site, you first examine the historical information. I heard mention of phase 1 environmental site assessments. And you look at any sampling data that exists for the site. And you use that information to construct a preliminary conceptual site model and assess what exposure pathways may be present. This is also helpful for the site prioritization. If additional data is required, then you prepare a sampling plan and you can collect additional samples. Once you have all the data that you need, you can revise your CSM and then prepare an environmental hazard evaluation. The EHE and the site characterization data should be used to prepare a list of remedial alternatives and conduct a remedial action alternatives analysis. This will help select the appropriate remedial action for your site. At some sites, a removal action may be the appropriate interim or final action. Removal actions may rely on controls to eliminate the exposure pathway rather than remediate the contaminant, such as capping or solidification. A removal action may be followed by additional remedial actions or may complete the response action. Use the EHE to decide which is the best course of action for your site. Next slide, please. This is a slide of the EPA's Remediation Technologies Matrix, which is designed to be used to help determine the appropriate remedial alternative for your site. The matrix allows you to screen 64 different technologies for soil and groundwater remediation. Oftentimes, people only compare one of two extremes, either dig it all up and take it to a landfill, or just slap a EHMP on it and leave it there. But as you can see here, there's a lot of other options available that we'd really like you to consider before jumping right to one of those sort of extreme steps. Next slide, please. And of course, what everybody wants is the coveted no further action determination for their site. Usually it's a property owner of a low priority site who will come to us because he wants or he needs a no further action to help with refinancing or real estate transaction or redevelopment project. And then we at the HERE office have to explain to them that they cannot achieve that no further action status unless the site has been cleaned up. And for an NFA, that means completely to unrestricted use status with contaminant concentrations reduced to below the most stringent Tier 1 EALs. This is also sometimes called a clean NFA, unrestricted NFA. Next slide, please. Anything that's any less complete response action can at best only receive a NFA with institutional controls or an NFA with ICs. And those ICs, those institutional controls, will require long-term management, usually with an environmental hazard management plan to ensure that the contamination is safely managed in place indefinitely or until further remedial action is conducted. Sites with the NFA with ICs designation are not free of contamination. Contamination is simply managed in place. And failure to comply with the requirements listed in the Environmental Hazard Management Plan or in the NFA with ICs letter could result in an immediate revocation of that designation. Next slide, please. The conundrum for the HERE office is that while our law requires us to focus on high priority sites, for a variety of reasons, the low priority sites are the ones that demand a lot of our attention. Low priority sites have even become high priority sites when, for example, contaminated media that was being adequately managed in place is removed during redevelopment without proper coordination with HDOH, and that contamination is essentially re-released to other areas or to previously uncontaminated properties. This occurred when contaminated soil from Radford High School ended up in someone's backyard in Kaneohe, not just a few years ago. To address low priority sites, the HERE office has designed two programs, the Voluntary Response Program, or VRP, and the Fast Track Cleanup Program. Both programs follow the response action steps I previously described. They just require differing levels of effort from the HERE office and the property owners and their consultant. Next slide, please. The VRP program is significantly more involved than the consultant, with the consultant being required to meet a series of 10 tasks to reach each of the goals, which is a letter of completion. Each task is submitted to the HERE office for review and approval before moving to the next task. And at the end of the VRP process, the property owner receives a letter of completion. This LOC imparts exemption from liability to the prospective purchaser and all future owners for the COPCs listed in the VRP agreement. VRP agreements can also be made with high and medium priority sites if they meet the requirements. Fast Track relies more on the consultant to move the process through to the response action with limited guidance from HDOH. We outline the steps of the response action with the consultant and the owner at the beginning of the process and rely on them to follow through. The end result is an NFA or an NFA with ICs for the release. The NFA designation may not apply to the entire property, and if additional releases are identified at a future time, those other releases would still have to be addressed with the response action. This is the case for all NFAs. They address specific releases or releases and don't necessarily apply to the entire site, although we tend to think of them as NFAs for the site. The LOC, which you receive from the VRP program, applies across the entire site as is specified in the letter and in the environmental covenant that's attached to the property title at the conclusion of the program. Next slide, please. So I'm running way out of time here. Often property owners prefer to leave it to their consultants to handle the sampling and remediation without entering into formal agreements with HDOH. In this case, the process would still follow the same steps as the Fast Track or the VRP. If you choose to go this route, we highly recommend that you make sure that your consultant has the experience and expertise for the job. The HERE office issued a fact sheet in April called Choosing Environmental Consultant that provides good tips. And we have a link to that as well at the end of this presentation. Whichever process you choose though, we also highly recommend reviewing your site characterization work plan or your sampling plan with your HERE office RPM prior to collecting samples. Very often we have owners and consultants come to the HERE office with limited phase 2 sampling results, asking for an NFA, and we have to turn them away because they just don't have enough data on the site for us to make an accurate assessment. Occasionally we even get submissions where people have done sampling in the wrong places or in areas that do not need to be assessed. On a recent project in Kaka'ako, a consultant submitted some surface soil sampling that, due to poor planning and sampling, indicated site-wide lead and petroleum contamination, but follow-up sampling identified that contamination was actually localized to a few small areas of the site. So do yourself a favor, save money and save time, and save face by consulting with the HERE office on your work plan. Which brings us to the last column in the slide. Do you have to do anything? Well, you may not. Melanie brought up to me a case where the county used Brownsfield funds to conduct an assessment on private property and discovered historic contamination. But in this case, there was no additional funds for remediation. So the owner wanted to know, what am I supposed to do? Are we required by law to remediate? This is the fear of many property owners, one that makes them reluctant to look for contamination and, if found, reluctant to report it, that they will then be on the hook for a costly remediation. The fact of the matter is, though, for low priority sites, if there's no complete exposure pathway, for example, at a commercial industrial site with asphalt and concrete covering the entire site, there may be no urgency to respond. We're not going to come after you. Remember, it's a low priority site. Sure, at some point, the site will be redeveloped and the contaminant will have to be addressed, but for now, it can be left in place. We just want to know about it. We want you to report it to us so we can file it and make sure it doesn't get lost or forgotten about. If you want to put an interim EHMP on the site, we'd be happy to review that and approve it as well, even if it's based on limited site characterization data. It may not be enough to qualify for NFA, even an NFA with ICs, but an interim EHMP approved by DOH shows that you're doing something to protect your site for site users, public, and the environment. Next slide, please. So that's it. Identify a release, report it, emergency response, site prioritization of the contaminants of potential concern, prepare an EHE and a remedial action alternatives assessment, conduct removal or remedial action, site closure, and then any long-term management with EHMP. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm afraid I ran over my time, but here's contact information for me if you have more questions and other useful links. Thank you very much.
Yes, Sven, thank you for your presentation. While we're teeing up our next speakers, when you do come up with these situations where there aren't enough sampling results, or you weren't provided enough information, is it usually a consultant or the property owner or a developer or all of the above?
Oftentimes what happens is the property owner or the developer will shop around for the least expensive consultant. And so the consultant will offer an option, of either doing a really thorough investigation or doing a limited investigation to get some basic information. And so, they'll go with option B. They'll get the limited information, but what the bank needs to assess their risk, or maybe what the property owner needs to assess their risk, doesn't meet what we need to actually characterize the extent of the contamination on the property. You see, it's kind of a different question that's being asked. When you're assessing your risk, you may be saying, well, is there contamination? Is it a lot? Is it a little? What we're looking for with an assessment is really, what is the extent of the contamination across the entire property? And to properly delineate that takes a lot more extensive sampling.
And which is actually a very good segue to our next